Okay, hi everyone. Hello. This is a nice crowd. I'm like seeing everyone's faces, and I hope you guys are having a good conference. I'm really honored to be here. I think anytime someone's like, hey, can you come speak about the work that you've done, not only does it mean that they've watched it, which I'm always surprised about, but it means that they liked it. And we've worked hard to try to make this show representative of the values of what cannabis culture is all about. And so I want to, first of all, thank everyone from New West Summit for having me. And then, secondly, acknowledge sort of the protesting that's happening outside as part of a bigger problem that I think is part of, as cannabis moves from a countercultural element to something that's part of mainstream culture, part of mainstream economics, that it's all the same issues that are at play. So, I, for a moment, thought that maybe I shouldn't speak today or should not attend or be inside the Marriott because I do feel in solidarity with hotel workers. I probably spend like 50 to 100 nights a year in hotels, and these are people who do work that's essential for me to feel comfortable and live a life and make my money. And if they're not getting paid if they're not being treated adequately, we should stand behind them. And so I'm gonna, the reason I am here today is because I made a promise to the people of New West Summit. And I think it was, there's a conundrum. Do you break a promise to sort of think about larger ideals? And what I sort of thought about is like, I have an American Express card that is a Starwood American Express card. The Marriott bought Starwood, and so now, effectively, like every month, I get loaned. Of course, they're probably not the banking agent, but I'm just so entrenched within the system of global capital that I can I can break a promise with the people who I've talked to and who've been very good to me, and stand in solidarity, or I can try to keep the promise and continue that solidarity by thinking in large terms about where we are as a culture of late capitalist people, and how that applies to the culture of cannabis and the culture that you guys are all growing. So it's all tough choices, basically. It's not easy stuff. And I wanted to take the time to acknowledge that before sort of moving into like what the show is, what I want to talk about, and how I think the world is changing, and how immensely unlikely this all is, and how that's fabulous, and it's something to be thankful for, and it's something to sort of really keep with you as you forge what is to be this new industry, and how we can not repeat the horrors of the past as we forge quickly into the future. So I imagine that most of you have seen the program Weediquette. Is that okay? Right on. Thank you for watching. I mean, I didn't sort of set out to be a cannabis journalist. I didn't set out to kind of have it be the thing I covered for 5 years. But I remember, the first time I realized that the way that mainstream media was getting it wrong, that they were like, hey, this is funny, a little bit tongue-in-cheeky, and like, we'll give a few seconds to how it's serious, but then we'll move quickly on to the next news story. When you examine the history of cannabis, its criminalization, and this new moment of legalization, it encompasses Western civilization from the Enlightenment onwards, about the ideals that it upholds, or puts out that it upholds, but actually betrays often. And so that's all to say, like, it's this immensely transformative plant that has transformed my life, both from the standpoint of someone who's been smoking pot for as long as I have, but then from like a professional's point of view. Like, I didn't set out to be a cannabis journalist. It happened, and as a result, I get to come to conferences like this and talk to you guys. Like, it is immensely powerful. So let's go through the deck for a second and see what we got. And I also think that given that this is a rather close-knit community, like, if you guys have seen episodes, you have questions, like, we should reserve a good amount of time of this for that, because like, I can be up here and give the speech, but I imagine most of you understand some of these concepts or feel them in your bones. So let's see, how do you go? This way. Okay, great. So Weediquette is about universal cinematic storytelling. It's about taking the issues that are the thorny issues that are difficult to unpack, finding people who are living a life that the stakes of which are sort of life and death, the stakes of which are whether that exemplify those little sort of things that are difficult to resolve. And we do it in a way that more resembles cinema than it does news. So this is like a very specific but deep construct of how we've made the show, which is to say we're not an expose. We're not exposing something to the world. We are emotional investigations. We're trying to take people on the face of what they're saying, believe people when they tell you that this has changed their lives, and understand and sort of deploy the tools of investigative journalism to see whether, to understand the story behind that story. And so I think, and you guys tell me if I'm right or wrong, like this show, Weediquette, we were sort of amongst the first to take that attitude towards how pot stories are told. Of course, there was amazing work that came before us in High Times, in Rolling Stone, in print, but as far as sort of news or documentary was concerned, this was not the MO of how people told these stories. And I think Weed the People, or the Ricky Lake doc, she's speaking also. And it's funny because we kind of started at the same time. They started before us, but as we were starting Weediquette for Viceland, we were in conversation with them because we were talking to the same people. And we're like, oh wow, how interesting. So I think the media has changed since we started Weediquette in 2014. The way people are telling stories about cannabis has changed. And it brings us to sort of this interesting cross point where the human interest, the human values stories, the way that cannabis has changed people's lives from a medical standpoint or from a criminal justice standpoint, that has also gone from counterculture or sort of niche culture to something that's far more mainstream. I believe that if you talk to people, more people than not understand the healing powers of cannabis. More people than not understand that the criminal justice system has been intractably racist and that the war on drugs has been the cudgel that has sort of kept it going. So where are we in the story of cannabis, and where are we as far as how media broadcasts it? And what is the next sort of transformational leap in how we talk about what's happening in the world of cannabis as it relates to the world at large? That's a question that I'm kind of asking myself, and I'm literally asking it to myself because we made 3 seasons and we've been taking a break, and now we're going to hopefully make a season 4 soon. But I want to make the show different. I want to understand where we are now, and I think you guys are the ones who can tell me. I don't know. I can make some assumptions, but I'm very interested to hear from all of you about what you think is next and how we can tell stories about this next wave of cannabis sort of meeting mainstream culture. So next slide. So this is the part sort of I'm talking about. If you kind of just boil down all of the characters that we met along the way, their journeys are cut really deeply to the heart of our identities. You're trying to get your husband out of prison. You're trying to protect your family. You need to kick an addiction. You're helping your fellow veterans. You're trying to practice your religion. You're simply just trying to land a job. You're surviving brain injury. And growing your business. These are things that we do, and these are things that humans do. So what we tried to do was say, what are the most universal human characteristics that we can find? Who are people who are exemplifying that in their struggle as it relates to cannabis? And let's see what happens. Let us find people who are exemplary of these issues and try to follow them for as long as we can to see something happen, to see something change in their life, either for the positive or for the negative. And that investment of just saying, you know what, I'm interested in how this turns out, viewers at home are interested in how it turns out. And I think one of the most surprising parts of making this show is that we make it for Vice Media, which is like a youth media company, and the demographic is millennials. Like, that's who we're going for. That's who we've been very successful in talking to. But for the first few seasons and continue to this day, people, when they come up to me and share that they watch the show, oftentimes say that they watch it with their families. That it's like a thing that like you don't watch it alone at night or like in the middle of the night. You watch it together with people you love, because it's like all about family love. And I think that the concept of family love and what is family love can be thought of as a very sort of circumscribed kind of love. And I think it can be thought of in a very universal kind of love. And so one thing that part of our effort was to sort of make people feel that connection with the people that they love the most, and see how much we can expand that past the traditional boundaries of how we think about who's us and who's them. Because I think, like, for people who've been told their whole lives that pot is a stupid drug, it's the them who think that it's not. And the more that we can see the them as the us in whatever circumstance or whatever topic, the more we're using media to expand the horizons of what humanity looks like, or who constitutes a true human being. Because I believe it's all of us, but I think the structures of power have always tried to pit we're the real human beings and the other ones aren't. And so this is all to say, like, it's pot, but it's people. And I think everyone feels that in their bones. I think that's like when you come to a conference like this, when you're inspired to do what you do, it comes from that feeling of deep, expansive humanism. And so film is just a really great way of deploying those feelings, of leveraging that in people. And so these faces sort of tell that story, and it's great. So I'm going to go through the topics, and you'll see why I'm doing this, because the stakes of what people are facing in life on the health side and the justice side are all big. They're all things that are universal elements of what it's about. So like cancer, like the medical stuff, the social justice stuff. And the conundrum that I face, and that I think storytellers today face, and you guys are the ones who are making the history happen, is like, how do you make the business side universal? How do you make it less about like who's the one who gets rich, like, and make it more about who's the one that's creating value, or how does one create value, or what does cannabis as an economic proposition mean to the future of how capitalism might work in this country and abroad for the next 15 or 20 years. And so that's why it's like, this is the conundrum. It's like, these are life or death. That's about freedom. I might be wrong, and I'm hoping to hear from you guys on this, but like, when you think about the business, like female entrepreneurship, that makes sense. Inclusion of POCs, that makes sense. The green rush, okay, it's kind of like a big topic. The black market, the international supply chain, like, how can I make business interesting? I think that's what I'm asking you guys. And I know that's like a funny question to ask, but because you guys live it every day. And part of me, I thought to myself, like, oh, I could today say, the message I could deliver to you guys is like, how do you make interesting pitches to journalists who want to, how do you get yourself out there? And then I looked down sort of through the speakers list, and there seems to be, there's a public relations firm here, there's a couple. There are media firms, there's a growing industry of people who are probably smarter than me about this stuff. So I'm not, I don't think I should try to lecture or elicit my advice there. And more, I'll try to ask it as a question. Like, how do I do this? Because I think the vehicle of film helps you guys, for sure, helps me, but it is the way to change people's minds. So yeah, I mean, it's an open question, and it sort of brings me to this kind of like bigger overview of thinking that I'm having. And again, tell me where I'm wrong here. But the history of sort of cannabis, also, isn't this a great picture? I'm like making a TV show for 3 years is pretty cool because you can get decks of you doing the coolest shit possible. So that was in Colombia. We were riding with the national police, as they were taking out a cocaine field. They're doing an eradication mission. And the sort of next stop for this group was to go to Cauca, the mountains of Cauca, where cannabis growers have been growing cannabis. Largely they're indigenous cannabis growers who did not have licenses under their new system to do so. So it was a real moment of like, who's gonna be the winner and who's gonna be the loser. It was a lot like the story that we did with Swami and Nikki about sort of like this corporate pot versus sort of like who owns the sort of original, authentic culture of cannabis? And can all of us own it, or is there like a fight? Is it a dialectic? I think these are big questions that are happening. So that was like a really good articulation of sort of the moment that we're at. It's expanding, it's being subsumed by capitalism, and can it change the way that capitalism works, or will it just sort of get diluted into the same, like when you guys have shareholders, are you just gonna have the same pressures of delivering value to everyone, which is gonna mean you're gonna have to pay your workers less? I don't know, and I'm not here to lecture you, because like you guys have to do your business, and business capitalism as it's worked has brought billions of people from abject poverty into the middle class. Like it's done incredible things. So in my big overview, the history of cannabis is, the first chapter was written by activists, by people who were advocating for, telling the story, growing, and putting together the cannabis community that we know. I think the second chapter, and I might be a little biased in thinking about this, was written by the journalists. It was written by people who told those stories to a broader population. And then that was sort of picked up by politicians who changed some of the laws. Should be noted, I'm sure you guys know this, but like most of the states in the US that have legalized haven't legalized through legislation, but by direct voter action, which is something we can also talk about how votes matter and we can do it. But so yeah, those are the first two chapters, and they were seismic chapters, each one of them. I think the second chapter probably the biggest, but like the way that things have moved have accelerated. And it's my opinion that the third chapter is going to be written by marketing. They're written by marketers, by business people. The story of cannabis will be written in marketing boardrooms from Madison Avenue to here in San Francisco. And so like what is incumbent upon everyone who's telling this story is to understand how that story can still be universal while also representing the interests of people who are putting labor into making it happen. So again, I'm interested to hear your guys' take on this sort of basic thesis. So this is the slide where I was like, I'm gonna tell you guys what it's all about. But let's just talk about this image, because this was in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, on Lake Kivu in our first season of Weediquette, where we went to communities that were probably the most vulnerable communities I've ever encountered, who were relying on cannabis in many different, in specific different ways as a subsistence crop, as a way of having some economic independence, as a medicine that was traditional. And that's part of the universality. Like it's used around the world in these very fundamental ways. So how can we think about the value that everyone's creating? How can we expand the concept of what that value is? Is that value just capitalistic? Is it a value of money? Is it a value of the goodness of the product? Is it a value of the values of the communities that you're creating? And I think like if I'm offered pitches about like if that becomes sort of the central through line of what a business is about, like I'm automatically interested because it's not just a horse race. It's not just like the technicality of of the problem that you're solving. Like every business sort of tries to solve a problem in a new and innovative way in order to deliver value to their customers and to potentially the people who invested in them. But what is that, like, how do you expand the concept of value? And do you have like a simple narrative for that? Do you have a way of explaining that in a couple sentences? The second one is equity. And I think like we're in Oakland. We did a story about inclusion of people of color in the industry. Oakland was one of the first cities to have sort of an equity program in actually doling out who is allowed to make money from pot. And I think that's the other sort of like, do we live in a free market? Like, no, it's free the marketplace of who is able to reap the biggest rewards oftentimes comes from who is given the opportunity to do that. So I think like, what is the equity that you and your business and the people you do business with are delivering? Are you trying to expand that umbrella of equity? Are you bringing people in who otherwise would be shut out? And like when I hear that, I'm like, okay, that sounds like something I want to cover. And then tech. It's like it's another conundrum for me. Like I don't know how to cover tech in a way that, because it's visual for sure, but what are the stakes beyond the technology? What is it addressing? And how can technology, which is sort of a cold, just by nature it's rather cold, be something that can be warm and humanistic? And I don't have the answers to those questions. I'm hoping that this is the kind of thing that you guys can be thinking about as you're building your businesses, as you're thinking about how the story of those businesses can be told. So I mean, that basically brings me through what I was trying to say. So I'll put the thank you slide up here. I had a reel, but it didn't come through, and I'm sure most of you have seen the show in some way. But I think, with the time that we have left, which is maybe 35 minutes or maybe 15 minutes or so, like, I'd really like to hear from you guys. Like, do you have questions about specific episodes? Like, can I give you some behind-the-scenes stuff? Are there larger questions about storytelling or about pitching or stuff like that? Yeah, please.
So I loved your episode when you went and you were with the parents that were using cannabis to treat their children.
Mm-hmm.
And then you tried some of the oil, and it was really heavy-duty, strong. I think it was 1,000 milligrams. So I was wondering how much THC was in that dose that you took when they kind of honed in on you after you'd taken it. You looked like it was hitting you pretty hard.
Yeah. So the question was, this is season 1, episode 1. It was a story about children who had cancer, who were trying to treat both the sort of side effects of the chemotherapy, but also try to treat the cancer itself with cannabis. And I took a really strong dose of cannabis oil that was made in front of me, and I got really high. I think it was about 100 milligrams in that tiny little bit. And yeah, I mean, it hit me really hard. But it was fun and scary. It was that was the first time between my mom calling me, or me calling my mom when I was super stoned, which I have actually a really good story about that. And that was what said to people, like, oh wait, this like looks a little different as a weed show. Like, is it journalistic or is it like a guy getting stoned? I don't know which one it is. And I think like people, that was like the mainstream sort of interest, and it came from that sort of like unsurety of tone. But yeah, so it was about 100 milligrams, I think, of THC. And it was, yeah, it knocked me out. But I was also, I believe, a bit of a sort of like, the effect of a few days of just like ingesting a lot of THC up in the Portland area. That kind of caught up with me at that moment. But it looked beautiful, didn't it? So I'll tell you the story about calling my mom. So if you guys remember the first, again, episode 1, season 1, the first scene is me calling my mother while I'm super stoned in a grow house in Portland, Oregon. And the story behind that's pretty interesting. But my mom was raised in India, as my dad was, and they came to this country in the late 70s. They think pot's bad. They think drugs are bad. They don't drink alcohol. My dad sneaks some wine in these days, which is kind of fun. So I came from a very puritanistic household that said you do homework, and then you get into college, and then you go to medical school, and that's it. And then you get married. So I did not take that route, as I found in high school. So I always lied to my mom and my dad about pot. They once found like a bowl in my backpack as I was going back to college, and I was like, oh, that's my friend's. And they wanted to believe that that was true, So I was able to get away with it, whatever. So I was about to make a TV show where I went on television and be stoned. Like, what would the uncles and aunties say? Like, I was really fucking scared. So we thought, let's actually run towards that fear. Because when Weediquette was a web series before we did it on Viceland. And for one of those episodes, I went to Uruguay, which is the first country to fully legalize marijuana at a nationwide scale. And I interviewed the president of Uruguay, which was like, great. Journalists love interviewing presidents because it means you got top access. And he was like a really cool dude who was like a former sort of left-wing guerrilla, moved into politics, had some very, very, I think, good ideas about how consumerism can't just be the way forward, like we need to do something else. And so I went to his farm. He doesn't live in the presidential palace. He lives in this like little farm, his little dog. And so we interviewed him, and at the end I was like, hey, Pepe, his name was Jose Mujica, who goes by Pepe, do you mind if I do a J? Do you mind if I smoke a joint? And he was like, yeah, please, smoke the joint. And so I smoke a joint in front of the president of Uruguay. I ask him if he wants a joint. He doesn't want to. But it became like a pretty big deal in the South American press, I think even in the press up here. And so we filmed it. I didn't tell my parents that I'd smoked weed on camera, and I had yet to do that. I hadn't done it yet. And so the night before it came out, I thought to myself, like, I gotta call him. Like, I have to tell my mom and my dad that this is gonna be on the internet, and they're gonna see it. And so I called my mom, and she's really disappointed. Like, the kind of like disappointed Indian mother that like, I don't even know how to explain these feelings in words. Like, I mean, I've done it. I've spent a lot of money in therapy trying to explain these feelings in words. But yeah, and she was really disappointed. She kind of like was silent and didn't really say much other than like, I can't believe you did this. Talked to my dad. My dad was like, your journalism career is ruined. He was very practical. And of course, ironically, he was 100% wrong. It was made in a strange way. And I think it was made for a good reason, which is to say, like, Dr. Sanjay Gupta has done probably the most widespread good for the messaging of medical marijuana. One thing he didn't do is smoke pot. And in not smoking pot, he drew a line. He said, they do that, I'm a doctor, and I have the authority, and I don't do that. And so the reason I smoke pot on camera is because I like to smoke pot, but also like I can have authority and I can be a smart person who like has a rational brain and smoke pot. So we're not saying that out loud, but we're representing it. That's like what we're doing. And so I didn't have the words to tell that to my parents at that point. Like I hadn't figured it out myself. I just knew like I gotta smoke pot. I smoke pot. So then fast forward, it came out. We didn't really talk about it. Like whatever. You're working on other stuff, right, Krishna? Yeah, totally. And then we started making preparations for the Viceland television channel. And I was working as a development executive for the channel, so we were working on a whole slate of new shows. It was really exciting, and I was like, yeah, I'm an executive now. I feel really good about myself. But then the months went by, we made some good shows, and I really wanted to get out in the field again because we'd ask ourselves, like, hey, who should host this show about black markets? Or who should host this show about sports around the world? And every time I'm like, I kind of want to do that. I want to go out and be the journalist, like do what I like to do. And I was kind of dying in the office. So I was like, guys, can we please make Weediquette? And at first, the room was pretty silent. They were like, well, it's a weed show. Like, that's pretty, like, what are we going to do? Like, Cheech and Chong stuff? Like, I don't really, like, yeah, your web show is good, but is it really broad enough? Are we really saying something with this? And then Tom Freston, who was, he was an executive who worked at MTV right when it came out. He's been on the board of Vice for quite some time. And he's like the world's most interesting man. Like he's done everything. It's like so great. And he sat in the back of the room during one of these development meetings, and he was like, "Well, yeah, you got to have a show about pot." Then like next week, I'm in the room with Spike Jones, who's our creative director, and he's like, "All right, Krishna, we got to crack this. Like, how do we make this show? Like, we want to make a weed show. Weediquette is obviously the one that does the best. Let's figure it out. What is the next thing? Like, why is it you? Why are you hosting it? What's your story?" And I told him about the Uruguay story. And he was like, that's the show. The show is, sure, pot is going mainstream and it's a moment in history that we won't live again, and it's gigantic, and we should cover it. But the show is you're having a conversation with your mom, and you're trying to tell her, frankly, like, I'm not a bad person. Like, I'm still your son. Like, these very, like, he was smart. I think he was right. So in that moment, he was like, so, season 1, episode 1, I want you to be high, and I want you to call your mom. So we did it. And my mom, like, I guess I should have brought the clip for this, but she was so, I couldn't script a better response from her. You know, she was like, she was both kind of outraged, but a little, like, she thought it was funny. Then she was like, get out of there, don't smoke pot anymore. And then she was like, promise me, you'll never smoke pot on camera. Cut to a montage of me smoking pot on camera like 15 times. And yeah, I mean, I think it was cute and it's funny, but it was also, there was a real reason behind it. So thanks for the question. Another couple questions. One thing I do want to do is say, you know, let's take some time. I have an hour. I'd like to take some time at the end, like, to sort of leave stage and go sort of dialogue with the people who are protesting, and be there in solidarity. Because I think, yeah, exactly. As I said at the beginning, these are related topics. Like, we need to pay people, we need capitalism to work or change, and we need to think beyond the bottom line of just of confrontation as being the way that we solve problems.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I love your show. I'm so glad it's on and out there for everybody and for what you've done. But my question was, you kind of answered some of it, but coming from the web show and then going into Viceland, you were already working there then as an executive. So I mean, I come from the entertainment side of things. So were you trying to pitch your stuff right away to get it on? I mean, was there any correlation between you getting the gig there, you know, to help develop stuff and what they saw? And
Yeah, the correlation specifically was I just had a kid. My son, he's 4 years old. And so my thought was like, you know what, I can't be on the road all the time. So I'm gonna be an office cat and like make some great stuff. And I had really exciting meetings, you know what I mean, with like really exciting people that I admired. So, but after, you know, 8 months of that, I wanted to get into the game. And I like had a frank conversation with my wife, and she was like, yeah, get out there. So that was, I mean, the easiest. My other thing is I don't think any other network would have greenlighted this show. Viceland was the only place out there would take a chance on me, like basically unproven, on a topic, doing it serious. Like, you know, we delivered the first episode, which was Cancer Kids. Then we did Stoned Vets. And then we did War on Drugs, the story of Bernard Noble, who 13 years for 2 joints. The Stoned Vets episode, like, brought so many people on board to the tonality of the show because they, first of all, the character we followed had such a like moving story. It is against type in many ways, and you know, we're talking about 3-4 years ago at this point. So as the story has changed, like there had been a lot of coverage about veterans with PTSD, but there hadn't been the kind of emotional filmic investment in it. And so the execs, the people who were my bosses, saw that second episode, and they were like, "Oh, we get it now." Like, and then we did War on Drugs, and then by the time we did Emerald Triangle, they're like, "Can we have a little bit of fun, maybe? Like just some laughs?" And luckily we met Swami. But no, what I mean to say is like, no one else would have greenlit this show. And now, look at how many pot shows there are. And what I actually love about what Viceland did is like, there's Fuck That's Delicious, which is a pot show, because it's about a bunch of friends who like to eat, who smoke pot, and they're amazing friends. Bong Appetit, which asks the question, what is cannabis culture beyond just fighting for its legalization, without ever asking that question. They are just portraying a kind of cannabis culture artistry, and it's fantastic, and I think it's coming back. And you know, Netflix copied it. Netflix had Disjointed, which was, I thought, actually a pretty decent show for like a 3-camera show. And then there's High Maintenance, which is, to me, like this beautiful humanistic kind of dialogue about what it means to live in a city, what it means to live along with other people, what it means to be alive, you know, and like that slide about like the shit about being alive, like there's a lot of resonance to that stuff. And so High Maintenance actually was being made as a web show when we were in development for this as well. But anyway, that's the long answer is like no one else, the short answer is no one else would would ever say yes to me hosting a show called Weediquette. And we got so much flack for the name, like Weediquette, especially from the British press. They were like, what the fuck is this? And you know, we kept it because it's the only thing we could think of that we liked. And I don't know, you tell me. Someone once said it's a good channel stopper. Like if you see it on like the TV guide as you're going down, you'd be like, wait, what's that? So that's why we kept it.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there an episode you haven't been able to make or weren't allowed to make, or like, we can't do this?
Mexico. We've tried 3 times. Because every time, like the story of Mexico is many different stories. Of course, it was one of the biggest producers of cannabis in the world. And it's where the war on drugs, you know, the war on drugs have certainly been fought on our cities and our streets and our communities, but we've also exported a lot of it to Mexico. And what is our relationship to Mexico today as our neighboring country? And every time, and it is a very violent country. So every time we've tried to go, we've been in development, something has happened that made the security situation in the specific place that we wanted to go like untenable and not a risk that we were willing to take. Then the Morocco story. We tried it only once, but the Morocco story is sort of like there's the people of the Reef mountain range are sort of an indigenous bear, like original sort of population. It is a World Heritage Site of hash production. Like they've been doing it for hundreds of years. And I think it's the most beautiful, it's like so beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world. And the day we were flying, the government of Morocco pulled our visas. Because, we're honest. We told them what we were going to do. We didn't say, we're doing a cultural story about rug weaving in the Reef. We were like, we are going to see the hash being made because we think it's really interesting and we think it's about, it highlights this incredible aspect of Moroccan culture. So we expected them to tail us, but then at the end, they just canceled our visas. Those are the 2. But I went to Morocco on vacation last year, and it was great.
First of all, I love that it's a journalistic approach. You have such empathy, and you really communicate well with the stories and the guests. And when you look at your slide for what's the future, and what I think you'll see a lot of here is it's now the story and the experience, and more normalization, and more bringing how the full circle of labor and business, but health and wellness are really coming out, and that we're freer to explore that, and that creativity, but also the science is really wonderful.
Yeah, maybe it's something about sort of the intersection of science and creativity. It's, you tend to try to put things in categories, but I think you're right. There's something experiential that's still kind of ineffable about like what it is to, the stone driving episode kind of spoke to that to me. We did an episode where it was about, is stone driving bad? And the problem, of course, is that there's no objective way to measure, like if there's presence of THC in your bloodstream, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have been impaired. We don't know the ratio. We don't know, there's not like a linear ratio between the two in a broad population. Of course, the way that we respond to alcohol varies upon the individual, but it's far more, there's more data, first of all. And secondly, it's just far more, it's a different substance, different chemical. So the people in power, who like most of whom haven't gotten stoned a lot, are like, well, presence is the only thing we got, so we're going to punish. And I think like it's hard to communicate to people who don't understand it that you can smoke a lot of pot and not be impaired. And I think that's, that we tried to sort of highlight that in that episode. And to me, it's sort of like until the people in power are the ones getting stoned, or like, until the people in power or people with power have understood that ineffability of experience, have the empathetic nature, or at least the worldview that more and more people are having now, I think, then the instinct is going to be to punish people without understanding their experience. Because they want to punish them because they want to deter them from doing it. And so it makes sense in the sort of rational, logical way that we should approach public policy, but it's actually antithetical to how we should solve or, make a safer place for us to drive our cars. Like, So yes, I think to your point, like how do you represent that ineffable, this thing that's sort of quick, so you can't really grab it. Like, what is it? I don't know. So we tried to do it through things like stone driving, which was also fun because we got to, this was amazing actually. We got to close down an entire like race course in the Pacific Northwest. We designed a course to test out the various ways that you need to drive. I got to do it sober, and then I took like a huge bong rip and got to do it super stoned. And it was awesome. Anyone else? Oh, Dan. So here, it's a good question. The problem is that it's really hard. We didn't do the experiment in the way that was the most scientific because we didn't have the time on camera to do it, or the time on, like we only had the course for a day, and it was like really, everything was really expensive. So I was much worse when I like just took a bong rip and then got behind the wheel, which is like not something I would do normally. So all we proved was like, if you get really fucked up, you shouldn't drive. But that was sort of part of the point, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's also something that young people should remember. And I think, you know, if you're a teenager, I think and this is something that I'm grappling with because like I smoked a lot of pot when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, but I think the literature on like under 25 and it having an impact on sort of neurocognitive development it's like somewhat convincing. And I think like there's an interest in my mind, like in the same way that we communicate what is expected of drink, like what are the mores of drinking, like there's a story to be told about what are the mores of smoking pot. And I think one of them is like, if you do huge bong rips, like just wait like 45 minutes, an hour, like have a burrito, have like a cup of coffee, and then you're off.
Hi, I recently stumbled into cannabis journalism.
Cool.
And thank you. And the show has been kind of a crash course for me in the subject overall. I'm curious from a journalistic perspective, one, was there something in your reporting that caught you off guard or surprised you? And two, do you have any general advice for journalists who are covering the industry to do so responsibly, I would say?
Sure. Let's see. So what caught me off guard? I think, well, in that stone driving episode, we had a lot of fun with cops. Like to say, I think that police officers, generally speaking, especially like cool ones, are trying their best. And they're always going to show you the best practices. And so I think what caught me off guard, what I learned is that it's easy to go in, especially and there was like the sheriff of Mendocino County was like a perfect dickhead to us. But it's easy to be confrontational or to put the us versus them kind of thing going in, especially with law enforcement. But the more you try to the more you just sort of take their job, like they're hammers as people, you know what I mean? They've been trained to be hammers their whole life. They have a certain identity towards being a hammer. And if you tell them like being a hammer is racist, they're gonna be like, no, I'm trying my best here. And so I think like what I learned, the biggest surprise was you can be confrontational with authority, but it's also, you have like, the empathy that you guys are talking about, you kind of have to bring that to the people who you might not disagree with too. Like you have to, like there's equal measure of that, like I'm gonna put myself in your position and try to understand what the emotional logic of your world is all about, that alternate universe that you live in. And then if you put yourself in that universe and you're like, you're still a piece of shit, then like, you know what, they're a piece of shit. But I think that's sort of like, that would be both the surprise and what I would sort of recommend is like, everyone's got a reason for what they do and why they do it. It's so hard to represent the totality of a human being's motivation, experience, and action in 44 minutes of television, 22 minutes of television, in 1,000 words, and 5,000 words. So, just like, not root for the bad guys, but like, you have to equal measures of empathy is the way to have balance. Not equal measures, not false equivalencies for the sake of for the sake of balance, so to speak, but like approaching even the people that you think might be doing the worst stuff with empathy. I don't know, does that make sense? Nikki.
So, Krishna, one quick question. So you were asking about if we could give you any ideas for how to make business sexy in cannabis. So one way in that compassion line of thought would be, I've noticed among some of the investors that may have come in from a really conservative kind of background, that just being around people like us is changing them. And that's a positive way to look at it. So, sometimes it's nice to spin in the positive, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just one idea I wanted to offer up to you.
No, I think that's
Yeah.
interesting. And that speaks to sort of the how is cannabis culture changing the culture that it's coming into contact with. And I can see the scene work. It actually looks like fun. But then what you have to do is you have to find investors who come from Park Avenue and go to the country club in Greenwich who are like, yeah, I'll do a bong rip with you on camera. And that's a hard thing to find. Okay, cool. Sounds good.
First of all, I wanted to say that your show kind of changed my life
Oh,
a
thanks.
lot. And also the episode with Swami was actually something that really helped me learn a lot about cannabis. After working at a year at Apothecarium for a year, being able to be in the front lines and see everything, kind of use your show as a reference, that was able to help me and help people that were on the conservative side understand everything. I do want to present, like you said, mentioning ideas. Do you think it would be a good approach to maybe go to dispensaries and film those and see the conservative side of the people and see how they're maybe wanting to open up and learn more about cannabis?
Yeah. I have a hard, I'll say this very honestly, I have a hard time with dispensaries as a place. Not because I don't like them, I think they're great, but visually it's, you have to fall back on really tired visual idioms to sort of translate the experience. And it's really easy to get into this it's like the Apple Store of pot, or it's it's a hard thing to break out of. So I don't know. You're always sort of, film is also it's a medium of genre and a medium of people feel comfortable when they understand the expectation of where they're at, but then your job in the film is to kind of puncture it a little bit and move them a little bit further. So in either case, yeah, I think you're probably right. We haven't figured out a way to do it yet. Other than maybe we just spend more time there, but then time is money and it's,
Hey, how you doing?
Hey,
How's cannabis culture at Vice, where you work every day? Is it something that you guys partake in during the day, or
some people, yeah. I think Vice is not a monolith. There's a lot of different people who work there and a lot of different attitudes and a lot of different people. But there are, I think, yeah, people smoke pot, but it's not, I don't even myself, I rarely smoke pot during working hours only because I'm bad at emails, and I'm not bad at phone calls necessarily, but I just it's hard for me to keep my analytical brain in the boundaries it needs to be to get stuff done. I think there's some people who have the opposite feeling, and I know them, and they do their thing. But I think cannabis culture at Vice, it's interesting because at first it was sort of pot's boring and it's kind of lame. It's kind of it's hard to say a non-offensive word. It's kind of uninteresting on a basic level. It's not sexy or cool. And then I think that the story changed for a lot of people, and it's oh, it is about social justice. And I think as a company, equity, inclusion, and social justice are on the forefront of pretty much everything that we do. And so it's readily understood that marijuana is, and the word I used, cannabis, is an exemplary story to tell in that sort of progression. And I think, what I like about kids, basically, 22, 23, 24, 25-year-olds, is it's so normalized, and it's not weird. And so as a result of that, it's okay, let's go past it to something else to be more outrageous or to push the boundaries that as young people we like to do, which is cool. But you see new generations of kids who grew up with their parents. I mean, and many of you probably have come from this background. I certainly didn't. With their parents being like, oh yes, it's a beneficial medicine, So it's cool. Yeah, well, maybe
I know you didn't talk yet.
yeah, someone who hasn't asked a question.
Hi, excuse me, thanks. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for normalizing cannabis and bringing it into the mainstream. This question is a little bit about Weediquette. Excuse me, I lost my voice a little bit. But watching the show and bringing that forward, I think really changed culture in America. And then there's also these little pieces that you guys would drop in Viceland during these commercials where people would call in and just talk, just rant about something. Being some guy smoking pot on Viceland, this is ridiculous. And there was so much simplicity to that, but it was so impactful. And was that created in combination with with Weediquette and the the concept around that, or how did that kind of come about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole division of the Viceland channel that's sort of marketing and sort of in-house interstitial stuff, and so it's very important to have, as you build a new channel, to have the look and feel of that be impactful. I worked very closely with those people just on a day-to-day basis, both about what Weediquette is, but otherwise. There wasn't a direct let's do this in tandem for a specific reason, but I think it spoke to a point of view that was universally shared in the building, which is people, that if you think pot is bad, period, you're ridiculous. So, and I think that's we both, everyone is sort of speaking the same language. So yes, I mean, they're great. And there are other ones that are people I watched the PTSD episode and I was able to, there was one that really got me, which was a young woman whose father was a veteran of PTSD and smoked pot all the time. And she was sort of what are you doing, Dad? You're fucking your life up, stop smoking pot. And then she was we watched this episode together, and I finally kind of understood where my father might be coming from and why this is part of his practice or how it might be making him feel better. And so that's, usually you think it's the older person whose mind has changed to the younger person's kind of consideration. But it was so yes, those sort of testimonials are super important and interesting. Let's do one more. I think we've got a few more minutes left. And
Quick question, money question about funding. So obviously you have some big budgets now with Viceland to do things, but even before, during your web series, how are you funding everything?
In-house.
In-house?
Yeah. So
were you looking for investors along the way too, pitching your, the TV show and stuff?
I mean, thankfully, I haven't had to do that. Sure, Vice Media has taken on investment from a bunch of different places, but I ran a magazine before I worked at Vice called Obit, and it was about death, legacy, and culture, and it was really intriguing from a journalistic point of view. We had a really hard time finding an endemic audience who wanted to read about this stuff every day, and we had a really hard time finding advertisers, and ultimately it went away. And so what I always appreciated about Vice is that I didn't have to do that. There was people who were very good at translating the vision of what we do as a value add for the large corporations of the world. And I remain thankful. So thank you guys so much. It really means a lot to me to see you guys here, and for everyone for watching. And yeah, I'm just Krishna at vice.com. So if you guys have any ideas, just throw them my way.